I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to be a part of such an interesting series of lecture and its end. Thank you all for your interest on a Friday evening. The words monument and monumental were mentioned on many different occasions in different contexts for the past 2 days, and now I'll bring them back to your attention, focusing entirely on structures, public spaces, and very often buildings with no other function but that of commemoration. And I'll take you to Bulgaria this time. So what is a monument? A monument embodies a desire to preserve in time something as fragile as human memory and to capture it in solid material, and in this way try to fix it so it will remain unchanged for future generations. On the instability of monuments is research done during a master's course in architecture history that was focused on modernity. And modernity is a period in time of attempts for complete rupture with history, with what was before, reflecting changes in society. Provoked mostly by Western discourse on memory and the questionable ability of objects to perform as its keepers, it was intriguing how this works in an Eastern European context, and especially in conditions where what is considered historical truth can be quite unstable. Traditionally, it is believed that a monument's permanence would guarantee the permanence of the idea attached to it. And then a monument, or rather a network of monuments to events and individuals from a nation's historical past, would serve to establish a national identity, to anchor it in the present and claim its existence. But how can we have a memory of a past we have never lived? If history belongs to the past, memory, by its nature, relying on a living person remembering, is always bound to the present. Andreas Hussein observes in his work Twilight's Memories that if history is expected to be objective, relying on evidence, memory is subjective and personal. Moreover, a national past is usually remembered according to a variety of national myths, ideals, and political needs. Then what becomes paramount is where and by whom a monument is created. In 1944, the Bulgarian Communist Party needed to articulate history for the people in order that it would best serve it, by defining what is to be remembered and what needs to be forgotten, by simply excluding it from an agenda. So to create a memory for a very distant national past, these monuments that were constructed in the period had to compress time so that it can somehow attach the past to the present and create collective memory of a nation. My question is, how was this to be achieved, and what did it mean to do so with modern structures? The communist regime produced in the period 1944-1989 hundreds of monuments. You see a very small selection of them on the screen. After the fall of the regime, a large number of them were pulled down, like all monuments to prominent communist leaders, but many still stand in all parts of the country. Their fates have been as different as the monuments themselves. Some of them were abandoned, some of them that have been abandoned regained their importance in recent years, and some of them never lost it. What they commemorate varies from individuals, historical events, or simply ideals. Some of them are memorials to fallen partisans, others are dedicated to national heroes from the end of the 19th century, and there are those that go back 13 centuries in the past to commemorate in an almost mythical way the origin of the state. Their characteristics as objects of art also vary and show an evolution in the concept of the monument itself, from the classic sculptural group on the pedestal to more abstract symbols, and towards the 80s with these elaborate memorial complexes that would unfold with the movement, with the visitor, and tell their story. Despite the extraordinary numbers and characteristics, there has been no systematic research, systematic analysis of the current condition of these monuments related to the processes that had led to their creation, nor of what and where they commemorate. Some of them are becoming more popular now than ever before and take central stage in the debates of the legacy of the regime, as well as very often the current political environment in the country. A constant source of controversy and of attempts to split politics and aesthetics, the appear is either a platform for new messages, as is most often the monument of the Soviet army in Sofia, that has been repainted on several occasions for the last 5 years, or they just appear as spectacular structures, like these images of the eerie ruins of the memorial house of the Communist Party that circulate the web space. What images like this very often live in the shadows is though the history of the monument itself, what it represents, and the extraordinary number of structures that were built in the years preceding its construction. So the data organized in this graph, in this chart, was the basis of this study and gives a view of 150 monuments, comparing their location, relative scale, what they commemorate, the period they were constructed, and their current condition, with those hatched in black being basically in very bad condition of abandonment and ruin. It serves as a starting point to establish patterns through time and to discover how these monuments were thought of as narrators of history, keepers or creators in some occasions of collective memory, and how they perform this task today. So the task is not a critique of past or present politics of remembrance and forgetting, but rather to discover how these monuments reveal changes in what is considered historical truth within shifts of political power. And I will argue that despite the initial intention to fix a particular historical memory for eternity, they are unstable, and it's precisely their solid fabric that reveals how meaning changes. So most monuments constructed in the 50s would celebrate the Soviet army as a liberator, and this practice continued through the years so that every regional center received their own monument. In the 60s, the September Uprising from 1923 and the 1944 partisan movement became a prominent theme, a practice that also continued through at a steady pace. So initially, most monuments were dedicated to relatively recent events related to the Communist Party. In fact, okay, I can't change the slide, I'm sorry.
Maybe with this one.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. In fact, the first monument to be built in 1949, the mausoleum of the first party leader, Georgy Dimitrov, was given about 130 hours for design and completion, becoming maybe the monument dedicated to the most recent event ever. Being the mausoleum, an embodiment of a totalitarian cult to the personality, is the ultimate building sign. And the place of the sign in the city made it the first, one of the first targets of revenge after it became empty, after 1989. It was vandalized on many occasions, and eventually, after years of debates and competitions for its transformation, it was demolished. Although it was argued that empty of the body, it was not a mausoleum anymore, but something else, nobody found a convincing answer what that could be. It became notorious for taking longer to be demolished than it took to be built. In 1992, it was argued that in whatever way the mausoleum was transformed, or even if demolished, the memory of what it was would never leave. And even today, the empty site where it stands, which is still unoccupied, so the square among the trees is still empty, is recognized as the site of the mausoleum. So the monument still works, although in a different way than initially intended. A short walk to the east still stands, despite the controversy it causes, the monument of the Soviet Army Liberator, built in 1954. With a man with a gun pointed at the sky, it can never be at peace. Many want it demolished, arguing that it represents a lie, that the Soviet army was not a liberator, but an occupier. And this monument is nothing more but a propaganda tool to impose this as a historical truth. So the monument, as a representation of a historical event, becomes in a way a monument to the way history was written at the time. Others point to the case with the mausoleum and how little effect iconoclasm has for dealing with problematic past. This is also probably the most active monument to date, as we saw earlier on the colorful picture. It has been painted, decorated, and used in many protests and on many different occasions, especially in recent years. And in a way, it still performs its role of a site of remembrance, although this might be in ways different from those that were intended. Changes of the fabric of monuments like this have often the purpose to correct what is considered wrong from a contemporary point of view. And there is a particular hybrid among the monuments in Bulgaria that celebrate events from periods that are quite distant, and in fact have nothing in common, like the liberation movement from the end of the 19th century and the partisan uprising in 1923, as well as the partisan resistance in 1944. And many of them have been corrected nowadays in such a way. But it is interesting to see how they appeared in the first place. So the 70s, which is basically we have 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm sorry, like the years are not really visible. So the 70s was a period to celebrate the centenary celebration of the April Uprising and the Russo-Turkish War that put an end to the Ottoman Empire. And even though anniversaries were quite common, it is there is a particular reason why this was of particular importance for the Communist Party. Historian Yanis Tsoukalos argues that in the years following 1944, the Bulgarian Communist Party needed a way to legitimize its siege of power and to establish itself as a natural successor of everything that has been before. It needed an idea to unite the people, and in Bulgaria this has been always the fight, the struggle against an external oppressor. So fascism was equated to the Ottomans before, and the bourgeoisie was always presented as an ally to this external oppressor. So in a way, the class struggle became equivalent to the fight for national freedom. Hence the really strong importance that was put on events from a century earlier that were forgotten for quite a while before that. The hybrids, these monuments are one of the best preserved, as they still tell a story, a history that is valid from a contemporary point of view. And the hybrids, that those you can see are half in green and half in red, kind of managed to use this change in parts so they can get new life. Such as the example, for example, with this one. This is the monument of the three generations in Perustica, which originally represents the three periods, with three walls embraced by another curved wall, which symbolizes a banner culminating with the bell tower. It's made of local stone and on the hill next to the city, and it was to represent a keep of resistance against the oppressor. Each wall is at a different level, and the reliefs, deep reliefs, tell the respective story. The bell is the symbol of the April uprising of 1876 and was accompanied, as you can see on the picture down on the right, by a red five-pointed star that proved very easy to be removed. So this, along with the abstract nature of the reliefs, makes it very easy nowadays to ignore the narrative inscribed on two of the walls and continue to use the monument. It is actually used, especially in recent years, for annual commemorations. Even though the name has stayed the same, many people actually either don't know what it meant or just don't want to remember, or it is simply a habit. The symbol of the party itself, its memorial house on Mount Buzluca, was originally also thought of as such a hybrid, because it was meant to acknowledge historical events that took place on Mount Buzluca in the Balkan Mountains, to link them together and claim a place in history from the Communist Party among a pantheon of national heroes. But a part of history became so important that it completely suffocated everything before that. The initial concept was to have just a five-pointed star on the peak that would accompany three other memorials to people from different periods that would be in the area. But it grew so much in size that, as you can see, it became a building so big that now has completely taken over the name of the peak it stands on. So the five-pointed star is still present, but it's on the top of a 68-meter tall pylon that stands next to a massive circular ritual hall. Its circular form was to convey a feeling of unity and harmony that were inherent in communist ideals, as the architect says. Moreover, its location near the geographical center of the country provides a 360 degrees view of its territory on a clear day on the circular gallery. The ceilings inside were also concentric circles that were offset from the initial emblem. It can't be seen on the pictures, but it's the sickle and the hammer with proletarians from all countries unite written around it. So this was offset and was continuing into space, ensuring unity and continuity translated into space. Thank you. The architect claimed in 1981 that the exposed concrete it was made of was used just to represent purity and honesty. Although in recent years he just says it was used because it's a very durable material and can't be destroyed, and his comments on the current condition of abandonment of the monument is, but of course, nothing can do anything to the monument. It's made of concrete, so it stands there. But is the monument really still there, is the question I would ask. Even though it is this laconic, symbolic image, the story told within it was very carefully orchestrated. It started with this sculptural group, Torches. This is the transfer from the flame of revolution from the liberation movement to the partisans. It continued on a steep path through three piazzas to enter a semi-dark hall and just to culminate in color in the circular gallery and the ritual hall. And this is now all gone. So the image that you can see from a very far distance is still there, and it still represents a symbol of the Communist Party, although the ground of the initial concept has been lost. After 1989, no one cared for the home of the party for many years, until everything with any value was carried away. The history it was to narrate for the generations to come was not true anymore. It was considered rather embarrassing. The graffiti you saw on the first slide, Forget Your Past, appeared somewhere around 2008 and triggered the ongoing discussions on what we do with the legacy of these 45 years, and often accusations that parts of history are being erased simply because there is no will to be dealt with. But what can be done with this monument? It's when I spoke with the architect, Georgi Stoilov, in 2013, he has this idea for the monument, how it should be transformed into a monument of all of Bulgarian history, which owe its heroes and kings and rulers in granite on the walls, and a lion would replace the five-pointed star. And this idea has surfaced in other proposals in recent years. And what I find really curious is that is an idea that is not new. It is actually from the time this monument was created. Because the year 1981, when it was inaugurated, was more important for another event. Bulgaria was to celebrate 13 centuries of history. As historian Ivan Elenkov defines this anniversary as different from the centenary celebrations in the 70s, because it was a long process, a complex programming on a big scale of the spiritual and social life of the country. It needed a motto, and the Trinity past, present, future was proposed, and it would determine the reading of the past as a steady evolution towards communism, and would reflect in everything produced in the arts and architecture for the creation of the Jubilee reality. Among the monuments dedicated to events from the distant past of Bulgaria, you can see both in the end of the 70s and 80s, there are two that are specifically dedicated to the great anniversary. They interpret the same theme, 1,300 years Bulgaria, but their fate is extraordinarily different. So this is the first one, the first to be built. Founders of the Bulgarian state in Shumen is the biggest. It's a true rival to Buzluja in terms of sheer mass of concrete on top of a hill above the city. Although it has not only never been left to ruin, but it's one of the best maintained monuments in the country. The reason for this is that what it celebrates goes so long back in time that it seems has nothing to do with the communist regime. It is not so if we pay attention to the brief, which required a monument celebrating a historical evolution defined by a revolutionary tradition, to which the People's Republic of Bulgaria was the heir. The concrete volumes emerging from the ground represent a slow process overcoming the resistance of nature and historical obstacles in the evolution of the country through its foundation and establishment. The sculptural groups of granite and the mosaics are nested at the intersections between the blocks that create a dramatic space of cantilevered solid volumes in fragile equilibrium, as the architect calls them. The theme is interpreted as a narrative unfolding in an ascending spiral culminating with the lion, and all images are abstract, as you can see on the top two pictures. And their similarity and roughness was what was mainly criticized at the time, as they were quite popular representations of the historical figures depicted by artists in the 70s. These characteristics, though, are completely distinctive from the socialist realism of the earlier monuments, and they also represent a tradition in art that has been transferred from master to student for generations and preceding 1944. And even if they're still often disliked and ridiculed, this is one of the reasons why the monument was not disgraced at any point. After 1989, comments in the media referred to it as a monument of a totalitarian regime, even though there's not even a single sign of this symbol of this regime in it. But the concrete it was made of, a material widely associated with the huge prefabricated residential estates of the period, is a powerful symbol in itself, as well as the scale not only of the monument, but of the whole enterprise of its construction. You can see the scale of the sculptures and also the way it was built. For many, it is only a representation of the regime capable of pouring so much concrete on top of a hill. For professionals, it is a great achievement in art and architecture, but for quite a lot of people, it just still tells a majestic story of the founders. The other monument, built at the same year, to commemorate the same anniversary, has had a different fate, although it stands in the center of the capital city, or possibly because of this. With a different scale, this monument also offers a different interpretation of the same theme. If the previous one had a narrative, this one offers an abstract interpretation through the Trinity past, present, future. The three faces are represented by three groups of sculptures, culminating with the wing on top that would represent the future. A reason for its continuing state of, on the left is how it looked 2 years after it was completed. These are different phases at its current condition, this being the most recent one. There is an approved decision at the moment for it to be demolished, although there's still further discussions. So the question is, why is such a difference in two monuments dedicated to the same event? One reason is that there are rumors that it was disliked from the very beginning and there was no maintenance from the very start. Also, it was not entirely completed to the author's design. But I would say another reason is the way the topic was interpreted. The Trinity past, present, future, so characteristic of communist propaganda, bears too much the mark of the time it was created. So it is very hard to give it any meaning that is relevant from a contemporary point of view. So the shift in all these monuments that we looked at, to a great extent, follows precisely from the way they sought permanence. Their monumentality scale, the funds allocated for their construction, as well as the decisiveness of presenting unquestionable truth, refer mostly to the regime capable and willing to build them. They fail to refer to anything more than themselves, and it is not surprising that they are often referred to simply as communist monuments, no matter what they are dedicated to. Moreover, all of them represent mostly the historical interpretation accepted at the time. And it's not only natural that its meaning will change according to a contemporary reading of history. This change of meaning often reveals itself through material alterations, and sometimes the initial idea is hard to read or is even lost, for example, like the last example. Other monuments are so abstract that once the ritual of celebration has disappeared, even their names are forgotten. As architecture historian Adrian Forty writes, buildings have been an unreliable means of prolonging a memory. All too often the object has survived, but who or what it commemorated had been forgotten. The nature of memory, to be always bound to the present, allows people to invest them with new meaning. And for the end, there is an inscription on a column dated back to the 9th century, which is the rule of Umurdak, who used a period of peace for extensive civic construction and remained in history as the builder. It reads, "A man, even if he lives well, dies, and another one is born. And let the one born later, upon seeing this, remember those who had built it." It was used on both these last two monuments commemorating the foundation of the Bulgarian state in 13 centuries of history. But the question is, I'd ask, who are we to remember? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions?
Thank you. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask if after the change of the regime there remained any sign of this monumental tradition in Bulgaria, and if not, then is there any are there new monuments erected in Bulgaria for different historical events, and how do they react to these old ones?
In fact, there are. I mean, the practice of constructing monuments was not new for the communist regime. It existed before, and yes, it continued after 1989, maybe with a certain period that nothing had happened, but especially in recent years, there are new monuments, and they actually try to, in the same way as at the moment a historical identity is sought in the years before 1989, if possible as far back in the past as possible, in the same way like these monuments are dedicated to kings from the first Bulgarian state, which is like before the 11th century. They're also as art objects, they go back really back in time with something that would rather they're very realistic. They try to escape especially from these last abstract images. They're at a smaller scale, again, distancing themselves from the mass production, but there's also a reason for this might be the way they're funded, because there is no state funding. They're not funded by the state. They're either, even if they're initiated from local government, from local areas, they're very often paid for by donations. Very often, they're actually done by artists as a gift. So there is I believe that to a certain extent they're actually made to kind of cancel these done before.
I have a question about this Buzluca, this monument, this huge one. There's this ritual hall. This is huge one, and yeah. And what was the function of this hall? So I can't imagine that some politicians climb up this hill and meet there. What was the idea? Was it used once?
Well, it's a strange story. It was meant for gatherings, for celebrations, for actually welcoming visitors from abroad. They were usually driven by car. They never really climbed the steep path. The truth is, Buzluca was inaugurated in 1981. It actually functioned for very few years before it was closed, and it didn't have an open access. So you had to either have a written permission to visit, or there would be an event, a celebration, or someone important is invited, so he is being taken there and shown the home of the party. Also, another thing they would give is like these mass celebrations when they would give the pioneers, or the new members of the party would give their party membership. There's any sorts of official events, and this is why it's called the ritual hall with the tribunes. But basically, it was not an open place that you would go to freely. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture from the main entrance and the piazzas, but you could see on old pictures how there basically people are arranged in all these different sections, different colors with red banners, and it's a procession going between them.
In one case, you described that there's a difference in looking at architects and artists and experts on these sculptures and the normal public audience. This kind of monumental remembrance is not new and not a phenomenon of the 20th century, but it happens in every century. And if you look back to historical cases, and we say that there are some, not mentioning the contents, but there are good pieces of art and normal and bad pieces of art. What do you think about the artistic qualities of these things. There are some better. They are so good as pieces of art to be preserved, or they are altogether forgotten because of their content, or do we need some time to time distance for make such a decision?
I think the main idea of this work was to see what's the difference, between different monuments, if they look in a different way, if the art is different, if they represent something different, they're treated in a different way, and it is so. Depending on what they represent, they have like a better fate or abandoned. There are quite a few discussions, for example, about Buzluca, and as well as the last monument we saw, the monument in Sofia, mostly because that one is in the center of the capital city, that they're left to ruin, to fall apart. And there is this big argument, why? But they have very good aesthetic qualities. They represent the 80s art and architecture, an avant-garde. Yeah. Well, Schumann is very much liked. It has no problem with ruin. I think it will always stand.
Piece of art.
Sorry?
As a piece of art.
Yes. They are. I mean, especially these last that are built in the 80s, they're very characteristic. In a way, they're special, and this makes them worth of preserving. But I think it's very important what's the argument to preserve them. If you preserve them as a piece of art, this is important. It's a really valid question. But very often, I think the people wanting their preservation comes with this idea, no, this is a monument to 1,300 years Bulgaria, but this cannot exist anymore because this comes from a different period of time. This is why they would always lose against the argument, this is a communist monument, it has to be demolished. I mean, I could never really support demolition, but I think we should embrace change, that the meaning of this monument has changed and accept them as something new. And this is the only way to preserve them as structures that are quite unusual, yes. This is so much concrete on top of a mountain that I think at least it needs to be made safe because people go inside anyway. And at the moment, it's in a dangerous state. But I see no point of refurbishing it and making it what it was before. Or even turning it into something that looks like the other monuments.